Okay, everybody, this is presentation number 2, artistic development, and we're going to be talking about symbols, where symbols come from, and what needs to be learned before they can be sort of part of a child's repertoire of mark making possibilities, and then also what teachers can do to help children arrive at that moment where they can actually be working with symbols in a way that's meaningful to them. There's a number of things just to kind of review very quickly because presentation number 1 went into some depth around these questions, but just to make sure that they're present on your mind when you're watching this is the artistic development, what it is, why is artistic development useful in studying when we study children's art making. And one of the main things that I want you to keep in mind is that as a framework that orders the way that we think about something, the way that we think about art making, that we're learning how children think, and we're learning how they know about what's going on around them in the world. There's a lot of emotion connected with this. Their emotional lives and their personalities are developing, and by studying their art making, we begin to see sort of a window into what they value and what they're thinking about and how their thinking is changing. The research around artistic development, like I said, is long term, about maybe 80 years or so, maybe more than that at this point. And the basic one of the very most basic understandings is that children enjoy making marks. It's founded on making marks, and that mark making becomes meaningful really very quickly. It's not scribbling. It's not meaningless. It's not just frivolous stuff that goes on around the periphery. It becomes central. And eventually, as children make marks, if they're given the opportunity to continue making marks and thinking about their mark making, their marks begin to communicate really specific ideas, integrate their imagination and the real, quote unquote, real world in really unpredictable ways. Now, I asked you to memorize this list of the phases, and again, it's very important that you have a basic sense of the chronology of how these ideas came together, or how this particular set of ideas, how it goes through from birth to teenagers and beyond. So, gestural, generative, to the manipulative, to pre-schematic, which is emerging of representation, which we're going to talk about. Then to symbol making or schematic, so we have a form for ideas. The pre-adolescent really recognizes that realism is something that is in the world. Things look like what they're pointing at, and then to be able to draw getting the skills to be able to draw that sort of realism. Now, the combination of things that we talked about, where I want you to be able to identify specifically by looking at drawings, but also to memorize sort of as a group of ideas in your head, in your own body. So some of the key kind of not targets, but some of the key kind of characteristics of the various phases. So that the big achievement in a generative gestural era is when the paper becomes a target, where the drawing, the mark making isn't just randomly all over the house any longer, but the paper is a target for the drawing. The motor control begins to become more finite, more controlled, so the marks aren't veering off the paper. There's not so much randomness, inconsistent organization of how the marks are put on the paper, or the shape, or the design, or the location, or the color. In the manipulative phase, one of the things that we really want to pay attention to is that children are beginning to recognize that they are making marks, and they think it's pretty cool, and this increases the pleasure of mark making. Just moving your arm around is fun and all, but when you recognize that your arm is actually leaving a mark, and that mom can see the mark, and how that's very exciting, that's really, really fun. So it goes through the roof. There's more experimentation as they become more aware of what's going on. They're beginning to make sounds, even language, words that accompany the act of drawing. As we move into the pre-schematic phase, we are beginning to see that the better motor control is yielding more repeatable shapes and repeatable sort of understandings of patterns of colors, perhaps. Enclosures, dots have a meaning to them. The language is becoming more purposeful. So zoom, zoom, zoom might be a car going down the road, and at the same time the brush or the pencil or the crayon is going across the paper, so that there's a synchronous approach to that. The purposefulness. The images that we looked at in the pre-schematic phase are seeing the groupings of colors and these enclosures and the language, but also then what else do you notice when you're looking at these images that are on my slideshow right here, but also the images that are in the galleries that are on Google that I've pointed out to you as being there. One of the things that we're beginning to pay attention to is language, the emergence of language, and how labeling starts to happen. So this picture really exhibits a lot of the characteristics of pre-schematic: the lid sky, the line on the bottom, the sun in the corner, as the child, but it's a late pre-schematic. It's right at the verge of really being able to control things and be able to make them recognizable to the child's intent. But we can see that by labeling things, the child is perhaps not entirely confident, not entirely satisfied. So as a teacher, when you see that happening, what do you begin to think about encouraging further meaning making or further mark making with the child? How does that begin to inform the kinds of lessons that you might bring into the room? Paying attention to these ideas is really the first step. Noticing that you're noticing them, noticing that you're seeing them, rather than judging, rather than trying to pigeonhole a student or, we all like children's art, but rather than focusing on how much you like it or how much you don't like it, if you do that, then you often will miss the opportunities for encouraging learning. So these examples here ask you to really think about the role of writing and language in the picture and how that is beginning to matter to the child. And then we get to this point where a little bit later in their life, they begin to really get it concrete. It really becomes very recognizable to them in terms of the pointing, this idea of one thing points to another thing. And this is an idea of symbol making, or symbolizing, that I want you to think about, is that a symbol as a graphic, or we can think of all kinds of ways that all kinds of things, sounds or structures that could become symbols. But the basic underlying dynamic I want you to think about is the pointing. That when I do this, it sort of suggests that we pay attention to that over there. There's some kind of a object in our world, or a person in our world, or a shared experience in our world, and we can begin to communicate about that shared experience, or respond to that shared experience by creating symbols. So speech symbols, sounds, visual symbols, graphics, and so on. This is what children are beginning to kind of get. It's not something they're born with, but it's not something that takes forever to learn either. This is kind of the magic of right around this transition, where these ideas are starting to really take on a concrete, physical act of pointing. Look at this slide right here. This has a lot of things going on that are really remarkably consistent, and also some differences between the children in the same room. They're all second graders looking at the same, reacting to the same prompt from the teacher, the same invitation for drawing. I'm especially taken by the way the sun and the clouds and the birds are so similar. It's like the similarity is like a desire. There's a need to clarify and to standardize the representation, the representation. So it's in the world, but I'm going to present it to you in my drawing. I'm going to present it to you again. And it's really important to me that you know what it is that I am imagining in the world, so that when you see my presentation, you also will think about those things in the world, that sun, those fish, that swimming experience, that family. There's no resemblance, there's no visual resemblance at all, or very, very slight, if we can even stretch it that far. It's not, but that's not what the purpose is. And that's very important for us to keep in mind, is that the idea of a visual resemblance, which we might end up calling realism at some point, the representational realism, that is not the point. The point here is making a symbol that points to that thing in the world. Not that it looks like that thing in the world, or maybe only vaguely. That's not the urge. And that's a very important thing to kind of keep in mind. Now, as we begin to get more comfortable thinking about these various phases, we have to really focus on the relationships between them. And in order to do that, I want you to think about how you're going to visually connect them to each other. I like the idea of concentric circles, and I'll tell you why. As opposed to, remember, as opposed to developmental stage theories, which often depict their ideas in terms of ladders or steps or staircases. The reason I like concentric circles is because it allows us to map individual students' works, individual artworks, across the spreading out, across the growth pattern, but not all following the same pathway. So it's like we all go up the ladder the same way. No, it's not. The image of concentric circles suggests that we can move through the overall phases, the overall structure, or the overall map of artistic development, but we all can take our own pathway through that map, going to the left or to the right, sideways, around. There's a much higher degree of individuality and of response to the various materials if we think about it as concentric circles. So in terms of that, then, we also then can zoom in on the concentric circles, and we can see that the boundary zones between the edges, they have a characteristically, the line, the threshold line is still there. I mean, it feels like maybe it looks like a step or a staircase or something like that, but because it's curved, it implies the directionality of it. It becomes more fuzzy, a little bit more allowing of choice, allowing of crossing in different directions. Now, the way that I think about this map, and I would like you to play with this idea. You might come up with a different type of map. You might come up with a different image, a different visualization of how these things matter to you, which is perfectly fine, which you should do because this is your learning. But the way that, but it's important that you begin to play with this. So the idea of this picture that we looked at, again, it has a sort of clumsy mark making, and there's a preponderance of written words. We might ask ourselves, what's really going on? It's raw, it's uncontrolled. Characteristics of the marks themselves suggest that the kid is still really anchored in the manipulative phase, but he has one foot planted in the pre-schematic phase at the same time, because there's plenty of things going on, shapes and structures that are pretty easy to recognize. People with arms, for example, there's hands and feet and bodies. So that's all kind of really carefully, really suggesting that the child is beginning to understand the schematics, how the schematics, those repeated forms, begin to point to things. So if you were talking with them, you might be able to really see that. But what the labels then, already kind of talked about the labels and how I think the labels are starting to act. If I want to be able to identify this picture, being able to place it in this way across those thresholds, then gives me more accuracy in describing and thinking about where the child might be, what the child might be wanting to do next or needing to do next. I'm really very interested in this way of thinking about what the child begins to understand and what the child is ready to understand. In fact, I'll be asking you quite regularly to think carefully about what comes next, and we've begun to talk about that. This brings up what I consider to be sort of a sweet spot in the map of artistic development, the difference between the manipulative and the pre-schematic phase. I think this is where this idea of representation starts to really begin to take hold. It's kind of it's a major event in a child's idea of how the world works and how communication works. I think of it as a momentous event. Somewhere in this region, in this zone, this fuzzy zone between these two phases, is where they are really starting to get it. They get it in their mind. They understand at a deep, visceral level the immediacy of pointing to things in the world, to ideas in the world, to relationships in the world, to people in the world. With the marks. It's kind of like the entire world just sort of folds in on itself or opens up and expands their possibility of participation immensely. It's a very monumentally important event in a child's cognitive, emotional, social development. This emergence of representation, the idea of representing something. Now, the part of this is that as we talk about this, I mentioned this before. I've mentioned it, and you've read it in the readings. Is that there's not this linear progression. If we get stuck in this ladder mentality, this up the ladder, up the ladder, up the ladder, then we get stuck in thinking maybe about the linearity of development. And artistic development is just not that way. We see it so clearly as we move from one material to another material, as events happen in a child's life, as ideas come forward, and they go back and forth, up and down, around and around, in this way, in this door, and then back in through a side door. There's so many different moving around in this journey. This journey becomes tangled up and turned around. It's vastly complex. And so this image here now begins to, I hope, help you visualize some of the complexity that is possible when we're thinking about artistic representation. It's not a theory of one size fits all. It's not a framework that says everything has to be this way or it has to be that way. And if that would be a drastic misunderstanding of what the theory is about, what the framework is about. Rather, we have to see this as spread out across an entire lifespan, particularly in what we're thinking about here is a childhood. So at least in our case, we're thinking about it spread out, kind of fuzzy and molding and morphing across a child's entire childhood, a person's entire childhood. So, and part of the downsides, maybe a consequence of even drawing the drawing, the danger of drawing a drawing out like this is that it becomes too solid. It becomes too sort of suggestive of stair steps again, which I'm desperately trying to avoid, that notion of stages, that notion of stairways. Okay, so we're going to keep going in the next presentation and talk about what happens when how this recognizing artistic development in this way begins to imply what it begins to imply for teachers in terms of their practice. Okay, until next time.